Welcome to Eudaemonia, the podcast that is all about flourishing. Plug in, relax, and get ready for the goodness as we explore the traits and practices that can help you thrive in life. With your host, Kim Forrester.
Pick yourself up and dust yourself off. Maintain a stiff upper lip. Keep calm and carry on. How do you respond when you encounter life's inevitable setbacks? And today we're going to be talking about what it takes to be resilient. And we'll answer the question, is it truly possible to make lemonade when life brings you lemons? Now, Stuart Taylor is CEO and founder of Springfox, previously known as the Resilience Institute in Australia. In 2002, in the midst of an incredible career that spread across aerospace engineering, IT, finance, and psychology, Stuart received a potentially devastating diagnosis of brain cancer. Now, this led him on a personal journey back to physical, cognitive, emotional, and spiritual health. Through this experience, Stuart became a strong advocate for the incorporation of cultural practices into the workplace to nurture well-being through the body, heart, mind, and spirit. Now, I'm here at the beautiful British Club in Singapore, and I've got Stuart with me in Melbourne, and it's a great pleasure to be talking about how we can learn to flourish in the face of challenge and to share what it really means to be resilient. Stuart, thank you so much for being with me here today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be here, Kim.
Now, looking back through what you teach, there are elements of resilience that would surprise many people. Do you think the general population misunderstands what it takes to be resilient?
I think that is the case, and in many cases it's seen purely as a coping mechanism. And so I take a hit, I get knocked down, and the real measure is how quickly I can step up and keep moving. Whereas the research would suggest it is a much more positive attribute that is about bouncing back, but more than that, it's actually about how do you thrive through life and make the most of life.
What I've noticed in society is that resilience can often be used as a simile for durability, for toughness. And the work that you do actually brings a depth and a vulnerability into resilience.
Yeah, and I think that the toughness piece is useful because life at times can be really tough. And so to have that stoicism is incredibly useful in the heat of battle. But if your whole life is about that, then I think you're missing the point. And, resilient people do explore continuously what is their purpose and contribution. And when you're doing that, you're more likely to be embodying a resilient life that is about thriving and helping others and, growing as an individual.
Now, what you're talking about there takes self-awareness. And what I am concerned about is that people in their determination to be tough and resilient, they actually overlook or they suppress what they're actually going through. Do you think that's a problem?
I think it's a huge problem, and anybody can hold themselves in that strong position, but in doing that, you actually don't grow. You don't grow by keeping that stiff upper lip. You actually grow through failure, and it's in that failure that you realise where the opportunities might sit, or what skills you'd like to develop, or who do you need to have around you when you're in those sort of situations. So you become much more self-aware as a result of that, and even can see those symptoms approaching when things are starting to head south.
It's interesting because you talk about the 5 traits of resilient people, and one of them, number one, is bouncing forward. And that's what you seem to be talking about there, where you actually turn a challenging situation, a traumatic situation, into a positive. Tell me about bouncing forward.
It really is a marker of a resilient person. And I don't know if in my own experience, for much of my life, certainly up to the age of 32, I did have this delusional sense that I was bulletproof and nothing could hit me, and really life just would never end. It was sort of kind of that view coming through the 20s and into the 30s. But when I was diagnosed with brain cancer, it really was such a strong mirror test of what have you been doing and how are you living your life that has got you to this point. And I think when you are faced with that sort of enormous news that says you've got 2.5 years to live, you really do take a step back to consider that bigger picture. And look, I'm not saying it happened overnight, but it certainly gave me a perspective that I could actually play things or live things in a different way. And it's exactly what I did. And in the end, found that this awful diagnosis became the best thing that ever happened to me, as I did seek to change the way I live my life.
So how does bouncing forward differ from bouncing back, which is the usual phrase that we would use?
Well, I would say they're both important. And so bouncing back when you find yourself down a downward spiral is so essential. However, the only reason you've got down that downward spiral is that lack of self-awareness. And so your environment has crept up on you, you haven't attended to your resilience skills, and before you know it, you're in the place of vulnerability, a place of mental distress, or potentially even depression and other mental ill health diagnoses. And so when you get to that place, of course, it's all about bounce back. How do I get back to level zero? But life actually is about bouncing forward. So what do I do on a daily basis that does give me that core strength to have resilient emotions, thoughts, and spirit? You know, breathing, going for a run, eating good food, those sorts of things.
Now, you just mentioned self-awareness, and that is a second of the qualities of resilient people. What do you mean by self-awareness?
Look, I think the whole concept of resilience has that prerequisite of, do I know where I'm up to right now? As I mentioned, you actually get self-awareness by having gone through a challenge or challenges that have tested your resilience. And I think that's where you build self-awareness and grow through that. But self-awareness says, well, what is my emotion right now? Okay, so I'm enraged. Well, why am I enraged? If I step back and ask that question, now I've got some opportunity to change that destructive emotion, maybe towards frustration or ideally towards compassion. And in that process, I've gone from being dysfunctional and destructive through to seeing things with more perspective and ability to have a positive outcome.
Now, in my experience, it takes a lot of courage to actually become self-aware, to dig deep and have a look inside sometimes. And you notice that courage is a third of the traits that you mentioned. Is that the type of courage that you're speaking of, or is there another form of courage that helps us become more resilient?
That's definitely part of it, for sure, to actually have the courage to want to ask those questions around what is this emotion, what is this belief that I'm experiencing. But it's also courage to get out there and try new things. I think as human beings, we love living in a comfort zone. And it's called a comfort zone for a really good reason, because it's comfortable. It's a nice place to be. But unfortunately, over time, if we spend too much time in a comfort zone, it leads to boredom, apathy, and ultimately will also take us down that downward spiral. So in a way, courage is not a nice to have. It's fundamental to growth and resilience.
Now, the last two traits that you mention might be surprising for some people because they are connection and creativity. Now, studies show that we are able to be more resilient if we have a social connection, if we have a source of inspiration and support from the people around us. Is that what you mean by a connection?
Yeah, look, and it really is such a fundamental part of the concept of resilience. And resilient people have the capacity and, if you like, core capability to not be focused necessarily on themselves. They're focused on how do they help people around them. And so they take the concept from being a introspective to actually being that positive impact on others. So that's one component of it. But I think also when you are not travelling so well, you increasingly lose perspective. Either you're confused and can't focus on what's important, or worse still, you head down that spiral to a place where why should I even get out of bed?
That's a really interesting dynamic you bring up, though, because the first thing you talk about is actually being there to be of service to others.
Yeah, it really is important. And I think when I look at resilience, even as you were talking there earlier about that stoic view of resilience, it's still very much a where am I up to? Whereas resilience ultimately is where I have got that higher purpose of contribution to others, altruism, and so on. And those small those big issues rather become small irritations because it's not that relevant in where you're trying to take that contribution.
And the last is creativity. Now, I personally believe that we are most authentic when we are being creative in whatever form suits us best. Tell me how creativity leads us to become more resilient in life.
In a way, creativity is one of the circular aspects of the definition of resilience, in that when I'm really resilient, I can be creative. When I'm creative, I'm really resilient. And if I'm living with back to that stoic view, and potentially with constrictive emotions like anger and fear and sadness, I really can't see a bigger picture of how I could do things differently. But when I am in those authentic, positive emotions that are underpinned by good resilience, then I can actually see things in new and interesting ways. And as a result, take my talents and apply them in those new and interesting ways. And that's where growth happens through that.
So you're not necessarily saying that we should all take up portrait artistry, but creativity in terms of creating solutions to problems or creating new ideas.
In lots of different ways. And so it's creativity in terms of how do I use the talents that I have. And your talent might be, doing spreadsheets really well, or it might be basket weaving or artistry. It could be facilitating a meeting, whatever that strength might be. Influencing others, who knows? How do I do that in that new and interesting way?
Well, that's cool. So just for the listeners, I want to recap. So the 5 traits of the most resilient people we've just covered are bouncing forward, courage, connection, creativity, and self-awareness, really important. But you also teach that there are ways that we can undermine our own resilience. And you've written about how when we care too much about certain things, such as being perfect or controlling our environment, or, interestingly, requiring life to be fair, then we can actually undermine our own resilience. How are we damaging our resilience when we become overly concerned about these things?
It's something that I concluded probably about 5 years after my diagnosis, as I started to try to better understand why I'd gone down the path I'd gone down. And the more I looked into it, the more I realised it was all about ego and that self-image that you create in your mind, that for the life of you, you do not want anyone else to see as fallible or can be damaged. And so, in a way, you can live your life continuously trying to protect that self-image or ego. And when you're doing this, you are absolutely over-caring about the views of others, their opinions, their possessions, their performance. And as a result, your resilience has been outsourced to the environment rather than where resilience actually comes from, and that is from within. And so it leaves you at such a susceptible place where you can't have self-confidence. At best, you can have self-esteem that's been bestowed upon you by somebody else.
I can absolutely see that, and I can see, and we do it in so many facets of our lives. When we look for the external validation or the external power, we disempower ourselves effectively and completely at times.
Oh, hugely, and so many people come up to me after a presentation that I might have delivered, and they say, "Oh wow, I'd really like to learn to present like that." And it really comes down to that same discussion around, well, are you over caring about what other people think of you, or do you get up there and you actually give a gift to that audience and help them to improve their knowledge on a particular topic that you know something about? It's a different approach to how do I interact with my world.
I can see the direct link between caring about what people think or trying to control your environment and how that disempowers you, but can't we all expect life to be fair at times?
Well, I play golf. It's one of my favourite sports, and if you want to learn about life not being fair, that's a good place to start. I think every person on this planet could think of thousands of examples of where life isn't fair. The reality is it's not fair, and there's so many examples of where it's not fair, and the more that you think it should be, the more you start to paint yourself into an anger profile. And I think as you explore particularly the emotion of anger, it's all about musts and shoulds, and the extent to which things should be fair and perfect says I'm actually going to be pretty angry because reality is they're not, and who said they should be?
So if we can't expect life to be fair, or if that's not something that we should pursue, what should we be pursuing in life instead?
It doesn't say that we can't try to help people have a good life, and including ourselves, but it's an expectation that it will be is the issue, and holding to this necessity for that perfection really just leaves us exposed to being let down.
Well, I can see actually then after that discussion there that expecting life to be fair actually links in directly with trying to control our environment.
Yeah, I think so, and really, it's I used the word delusion before. It's almost a delusional belief that I'm so powerful that I can control what's going on around me. Well, good luck with that. And I think the Buddhists say it really well when they talk about this idea of equanimity, which in essence says, I'm okay. I'm an okay person. It's likely I'll prevail, and if things don't prevail, I'll learn a lot from that. So it's not over attaching to everything being just right, just for me.
So now the Eudaemonia podcast is all about making our lives more fulfilling and joyful, flourishing. So developing resilience obviously helped you bounce forward from your illness, from your cancer diagnosis. But how else has resilience enhanced your day-to-day experience of life?
Look, I think a big part of resilience, sure, it's about working with your stress and mastering your stress. It's about stimulating physical energy so that you can have more resilient emotions and a more resilient mindset. But the ultimate expression of resilience happens at the spiritual level, which says, I do have clarity on my purpose. I know what values I stand for. I try to operate with altruism, compassion. And when I start to play at that level, that does lead to the fulfillment that you're talking about. And so you can be resilient without this last level called spirit. But I think it is so fundamental, and unfortunately for our society, we've lost so much connection at that spirit level. I'm not necessarily talking about God, and you can choose how you reach into this space, but having a view of a bigger picture, contribution and so on is so critical to me living a good life, which in essence is very much that eudaimonic level of happiness.
I know precisely what you're talking about. I tell people all the time that we were turned into machines about 400 years ago. And I think that most people in society have learnt to solve problems, including, personal growth issues on a very superficial level. And so eudaimonia often comes from getting just a little bit deeper and forgetting what we've been told about this sort of surface machinery that we've been turned into, and becoming more soulful in the way that we approach things.
Yeah, look, I think that is so true. And I do believe the more resilient you are, the more likely you are to be interested in the welfare of others, and that in itself is a huge purpose. And it truly was the gift that cancer gave me, was to step back from what I had been doing and ask what contribution I could make. And the shift of career as a result of that, it's just been so fulfilling to be working with people in organisations to say, well, is there a better way that we can all live our lives to have that sustainable contribution?
Which brings up a very interesting question, Stuart. How can we each help and enable others to become more resilient? Our loved ones, our children, our parents. How do we help them discover resilience when they need it most?
Look, I think the first point there would be to help others to build the foundation. And the foundations are so important, because without the foundations, there's no point pursuing that spiritual level. If you find that your stress is out of control, that you're continually unwell, your emotions are negative, unless you can establish that foundation, it's really tricky to build that ultimate level. And so I think working with others to stabilise the platform is key. And for some it might be getting someone to join a exercise club with you, or involving them in some of the base practices around that, or teaching someone to meditate would be an interesting way to go, or doing a meditation course together. So again, these fundamental levels gives you the ability to then have that self-awareness and see where things could go. I think the other concept, to come back to that spirit piece, is the Japanese express this beautifully. I think they have a concept called ikigai. It's Ikigai, where they say, in 6 words, no more, no less, can you articulate why do you get out of bed each morning? And to be able to spend time thinking about that and see it evolve over time can start to provide a compass for where you want to be heading, and that can help guide your decisions so that you do stay true to the life that you're trying to live.
Now, Stuart, for those of us who have tended to rescue others and problem solve for others, do you think we undermine people's resilience when we continue to do that?
So I think, to come back to that overcaring discussion, there's a big difference between compassion and sympathy. And you see this in professions that are involved with caring, such as nursing, teaching, and so on. The principal role there is to absolutely care. The reality is, at times, that can lead to overcaring and trying to save somebody else. A resilient person tries to operate with others from a position of compassion, and that is deep love and deep care, but it's actually helping them to help themselves. And that allows for, I think, better accountability, but also that individual then learns, rather than, perhaps becomes reliant on you, or in a way could also become quite negative to you.
I understand. So be the inspiration, not the crutch as such.
For sure. And at times, that requires one expression of compassion, which is tough love, where that person might have become reliant, and it's actually not helpful or healthy to feed that reliance, and tough love might be the answer that allows them to make that fundamental shift that's required to grow and be more resilient.
There's a whole conversation we don't have time for right here around parenting and our mollycoddling of children these days, but we'll have to sit down another time and chat about that. I've got one final question for you, Stuart, and I ask this question of all of my guests. Can you suggest one morning reminder, so a daily practice, a mantra or affirmation, that my listeners can use to help them become more resilient?
I'll try and answer that. And I'll answer it in the way that I enact something similar. I meditate each morning. That could be for 5 minutes, could be for 15 minutes. And in that meditation, I do try to apply a purpose to that meditation. And so to me, the message I would give is find a message for that meditation. It might be around compassion. It might be around your ikigai, but it is taking that time to have a reflection on one of those topics at that spirit level.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Stuart. Now, how can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about how to become resilient?
Sure. The best would be our website, which is springfox.com.
Fabulous. And you have an amazing book called Assertive Humility. Where can people get their hands on that?
So that's available on Amazon.
Well, Stuart, I'm grateful for you sharing your time here with us today. And I hope you're having a fabulous day down there in Melbourne. Take care.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kim.
According to English philosopher Bernard Williams, man never made any material as resilient as the human spirit. You've been listening to the Eudaemonia podcast. If you'd like to learn more about how to live a truly flourishing life, please subscribe and check out eudaemoniapod.com for more inspiring episodes. I'm Kim Forrester. Until next time, be well, be kind to yourself, and know you will always have the ability to bounce forward.